Right now, millions of adults are trapped in relationships where they perform love with technical perfection, yet feel a chilling emptiness where real connection should be. They know all the right words, they make all the appropriate gestures, but inside there's just nothing, and the question that haunts them in the dead of night is always the same. Why can I understand love intellectually, but I can't feel it? Carl Jung uncovered something disturbing about this. He realized that in certain families, the capacity for love isn't simply blocked or repressed. It's actively destroyed and replaced by something entirely different. Something that looks like love, that has the shape of love, but is actually a sophisticated system of emotional survival. And the most shocking thing? Children who grow up in these homes become adults who can spend a lifetime without realizing that what they call love was never love at all. You're about to discover how narcissistic parents systematically destroy their children's ability to love, transforming Eros, the deepest relational force in the human psyche, into pure survival strategy. How they replace connection with transaction. How they teach that vulnerability means death. How they create adults who live in relationships but die of loneliness. And more importantly, how this wound manifests in your life now, decades later. Without you even realizing, you're repeating patterns learned when love was just a word, without any real meaning. The story of Ethan begins at 7 years old. But the damage was already done long before that. He doesn't remember a specific moment when everything changed. There was no obvious traumatic event, no dramatic scene he could point to and say, "This is where I learned wrong about love." Because the destruction of the capacity to love rarely happens in grand explosions. It happens in 1,000 small daily transactions, where affection is currency, approval is oxygen, and the child learns, neuron by neuron, that love isn't something you receive for existing. It's something you negotiate to survive. Ethan's mom had a pattern that repeated with mathematical precision. When he came home from school, excited to tell her about his day, she was always too busy, too tired, too preoccupied with more important things. His enthusiasm was treated as an inconvenience. His spontaneous joy was noise that got in the way. But when Ethan brought home an A on a test, when he won a competition, when he did something she could show off to her friends, then he existed. Then he got attention, a smile, even a quick hug before she went back to what really mattered. And something in Ethan's psyche, something primitive and desperate for survival, began to make dangerous connections. Love wasn't about being seen. Love was about being useful. Love wasn't about existing. Love was about performing. Love wasn't about vulnerability. Love was about demonstrable value. Jung would call this the moment when Eros, the force of relational connection, begins to die in the child. And in its place, something that he identified in his narcissistic patients is born: the conversion of love into power, the transformation of intimacy into control, the mutation of affection into transaction. By 9 years old, Ethan had already developed a sophisticated internal system. He learned to read his mum's micro-expressions to know what version of himself she needed that day. He learned to suppress emotional needs because expressing them resulted in rejection, or worse, in looks of disappointment that made him feel defective for having feelings. He learned that crying was intolerable weakness, that needing comfort was pathetic, that showing fear or insecurity resulted in contempt, thinly disguised as guidance. You need to be strong, Ethan. You need to be responsible. You need to stop being so sensitive. And he stopped, not because he chose to, but because the alternative was to continue dying a little bit, with each rejection. Ethan's dad had a different but equally destructive repertoire. He didn't openly reject his son's emotion. He turned it into a joke. Every vulnerability became mockery. Every moment of sincerity became embarrassment. Every attempt at genuine connection was ridiculed, until Ethan learned that emotional safety was an illusion for the weak. Love in Ethan's family had invisible but absolute rules. You don't ask for love, you earn love. You don't need love, you deserve love when you serve a purpose. You don't receive love for being who you are. You receive conditional approval for becoming who they need you to be. And here's what Jung realized that most therapists didn't understand at the time. The child doesn't simply repress the need for real love. The child completely reconstructs the concept of love in their psyche. Love becomes something else. Love becomes strategy. Love becomes vigilance. Love becomes calculated performance. Ethan's authentic self, that genuine part that needed real connection, began to be buried so deep that he forgot it existed. And in its place, he built a persona so convincing that even he believed it, a persona that knew exactly how to appear connected without ever connecting for real. By 12 years old, Ethan had friends, lots of friends. He was popular, funny, always around, but when he was alone at night, he felt an emptiness he couldn't name, a loneliness that made no sense, because he was always surrounded by people, a feeling that there was invisible glass between him and all other human beings. He didn't know yet that this emptiness was the absence of Eros. It was the space where the capacity for intimate and deep connection should exist. It was the hole left by the death of authentic vulnerability. In his teens, Ethan had his first relationship. He did everything right, technically, said the appropriate romantic words, made the gestures that boyfriends make, even felt something he interpreted as love. But when his girlfriend cried in front of him for the first time, when she needed true emotional intimacy, Ethan felt something unexpected, repulsion, mixed with panic. Her vulnerability activated something terrible in him, a contempt he couldn't control, a desire to flee, a visceral feeling that she was being weak, pathetic, exactly like he had learned that he would be if he showed his own emotions. He ended the relationship without being able to explain why, and began a pattern that would repeat for the next 15 years, starting relationships with enthusiasm, performing intimacy with technical competence, and fleeing at the exact moment when the other person needed genuine emotional connection. Jung identified this pattern in dozens of patients. He called it narcissistic inflation of the ego at the expense of the heart. The person develops an inflated sense of self-sufficiency, of control, of superiority over petty emotions. But underneath, there's a child, frozen in the moment. They learned that true love was mortal danger. At 28, Ethan was in therapy for the third time. He was intelligent enough to know something was wrong, articulate enough to describe the symptoms, but completely incapable of feeling the real wound. He talked about difficulty with intimacy, as if he were describing a technical problem to be solved. He listed behaviors he needed to change. As if he were optimizing a system, he intellectualized every emotion, analyzed every pattern, understood every psychological dynamic, but felt nothing. And that is the particular cruelty of this wound. The person becomes an expert in talking about love, in theorizing about relationships, in understanding the psychology of intimacy. But the ability to really love, to really connect, to really be vulnerable, that was amputated so early that not even a scar remained. Only absence. The therapist asked, "What do you feel when you think about love?" Ethan responded with a perfect definition. Love is connection, it's vulnerability, it's unconditional acceptance. Beautiful, correct, completely intellectual. The therapist insisted, "No, what do you feel?" And Ethan realized for the first time that he felt nothing. There were words, there were concepts, there were even memories that were supposedly about love. But real emotion, that warmth in the chest that people described, that feeling of expansion, of deep connection, it didn't exist. It never had. And at that moment, something in Ethan's psyche began to crack. A terrible awareness began to emerge. What if everything he had called love his whole life was just a sophisticated performance? What if he had never really loved anyone because the ability to love had been destroyed? Before he was old enough to defend it, Jung described this moment as the beginning of the true therapeutic work, the moment when the person stops trying to fix behaviors and starts to confront the fundamental absence at the center of their psyche, the moment they realize they aren't trying to improve love, they're trying to learn love for the first time as an adult, something that should have been taught when they were 3 years old. But before we explore whether this ability can be recovered, and we need to understand exactly how it's destroyed, because the method narcissistic parents use is much more systematic and devastating than it seems at first glance. There's a mechanism that Jung identified called the inversion of the relational instinct. In normal developmental condition, the child is born with Eros, relational force, active, a natural drive for connection, for emotional proximity, for bonding. It's an instinct, as primary as hunger or thirst. The child needs connection to survive psychologically. Sufficiently healthy parents respond to this instinct in a way that the child learns. My need for connection is legitimate. My vulnerability is safe. My love will be reciprocated. And so Eros, relational force, develops healthily in the psyche. But narcissistic parents do something much more cruel than simply denying connection. They condition the child to associate their own need for love with intolerable pain. Every time Ethan, at 4 years old, ran to his mom, needing comfort after a nightmare, he didn't receive direct rejection. That would have been easier to process. He received something worse. A sigh of irritation, a look of disappointment, a seemingly innocent phrase like, "Again, Ethan, you're too big for such nonsense." And the message that was etched into his unconscious wasn't just, "I won't receive love." It was something much more destructive. "I am wrong for needing. My need is a defect. My desire for connection is a pathological weakness." Jung perceived that this created a catastrophic division in the child's psyche. The instinct of Eros, relational force, continues to exist. It's biologically impossible to kill it completely. But now, it's associated with deep shame, with a feeling of defectiveness, with the terror of rejection. So the child does the only thing they can do to survive psychologically. They repress Eros, relational force, so deeply that they lose conscious contact with it. And in its place, they develop what Jung called a compensatory persona, a mask of self-sufficiency, an identity built around not needing anyone. Ethan, at 10 years old, had already developed this persona so completely that when a classmate at school asked him if he didn't miss his mom when she traveled for weeks, He responded with genuine confusion. "Why would I? I don't need her for anything." And he believed it. The repression was so deep that he had completely lost contact with the inner child, who was starving for connection. That child had been exiled to what Jung called the personal shadow, locked in a psychological basement, so dark that Ethan didn't even know it existed. But the shadow never really disappears. It just manifests in distorted ways, and in Ethan's case, it manifested in relational patterns that he couldn't understand. He felt drawn to emotionally unavailable partners, women who, like his mom, were always too busy, too worried, too distant. And when he finally won their attention, when he finally received something resembling affection, he immediately lost interest and started looking for the next one. Because the shadow, that exiled part, that still carried the original Eros, relational force, was compulsively trying to relive and resolve the original trauma, trying to make his mom finally see him, trying to make the emotionally unavailable person finally choose him, trying to prove that he was worthy of love. But as Ethan's conscious persona was completely dissociated from these needs, he never achieved real satisfaction. He got the attention, but couldn't absorb it. He got the affection, but couldn't feel it. He got relationships, but couldn't get connection. Jung described this as the tragedy of the wounded narcissist. The part that needs love the most is exactly the part that was most deeply hidden. So the person spends their life seeking something they can't recognize when they find it. And there's more. The destruction doesn't stop at the repression of Eros, relational force. Narcissistic parents actively teach a distorted version of love to replace the real one. They model and reinforce what Jung called the love of power, instead of the power of love. In Ethan's family, love meant control. When Mom said, "I only want what's best for you," what she really communicated was, "You exist to satisfy my needs and expectations." When Dad said, "I'm doing this because I love you," what he was really teaching was, love is justification for manipulation. Ethan learned through thousands of subtle interactions that love wasn't about two people meeting in mutual vulnerability. Love was about one person having power over the other. Love was about control. Love was about transaction. Love was about one winning and another losing. And when he grew up and started his own relationships, he unconsciously replicated these patterns. He either assumed the role of controller, subtly manipulating his partner through conditional affection, exactly as his parents did, or he assumed the role of the controlled, submitting to relationships where he was treated the same way he was treated in childhood. In both cases, he never experienced true love, just different versions of the same power dynamic that had been called love when he was too young to know the difference. At 32, Ethan had what he would later call his necessary collapse. He was in just another relationship that followed the family's script. It started intense, passionate, perfect, and then, as always, it started to cool off at the exact moment she needed genuine emotional intimacy. But this time, something different happened. She didn't simply accept his distancing, she confronted him. She asked, with a clarity that cut through all his defenses, "Do you really love me? Or do you just like the idea of me?" And Ethan, for the first time in his life, couldn't answer. Not because he didn't know the right answer to give, but because, in that moment of raw truth, he realized he didn't know the difference. He literally couldn't distinguish between real love and the sophisticated performance he'd executed his entire life. It was in this crack in this moment of brutal honesty with himself, that the possibility of healing began. Because you can't heal a wound you don't recognize exists. And Ethan had spent 3 decades denying that there was anything wrong with the way he loved. Now, for the first time, he was confronting the truth that Jung insisted was the beginning of all real individuation, the awareness of one's own shadow, the acceptance that there are parts of ourselves that have been exiled, repressed, denied, and that recovering these parts is the most difficult and most necessary work a human being can do. But how exactly does someone recover the ability to love when it was destroyed before conscious memory? How do you learn, as an adult, something that should have been absorbed in the earliest years of life through experience, not instruction? The answer that Jung discovered will surprise you, because it's not about learning intimacy techniques or about intellectually understanding what love should be. It's about something much deeper and much scarier. Jung believed that recovering the capacity to love required what he called a descent into your personal hell, not a poetic metaphor. A real and terrifying process of confronting the exiled child in the shadow. The child who is still frozen in the moment when they learned that love meant danger. For Ethan, this started when he finally stopped running from the emptiness. He had spent his life filling every moment with activity, work, superficial relationships. Anything to not feel that hole in the center of his psyche. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to simply sit with the absence. And what he discovered there was terrifying. It wasn't just emptiness, it was pain, an ancient, pre-verbal pain that had been frozen inside him since he was 3, 4, 5 years old. The pain of the child who ran to mom's arms and found indifference. The pain of the child who cried and was ridiculed. The pain of the child who loved with all his childish heart and learned that that love was unwanted. Jung taught that this pain had to be felt, not intellectualized. It had to be experienced in the body, not just understood in the mind. And that's the part that most people can't do, because feeling that ancient pain is reliving the original trauma. It's allowing that inner child to finally cry the tears that were repressed for decades. Ethan spent 3 months in this process, 3 months of crying spells that came from nowhere, 3 months of rage that he didn't know he was carrying, 3 months of grieving for something he never had, the experience of being loved unconditionally when he needed it most. And here is the first big turning point that Jung identified. The moment when the person realizes that they're not crying for adult relationships that failed. They're crying for the child who was forced to become emotionally adult before they learned what it was to be a loved child. Ethan had this insight in a particularly intense therapy session. He was talking about yet another relationship that he had sabotaged, yet another pattern that he had repeated, and suddenly, in the middle of the sentence, he stopped and said something that surprised even himself. "I was never a child, was I? I was always a little adult trying to earn approval. I was never allowed to just be loved for existing." And at that moment, something fundamental changed in Ethan. He realized that he wasn't trying to fix his ability to love as an adult. He was trying, for the first time, to develop the capacity to love that should have been formed when he was 3 years old. This realization changes everything. Because when you're trying to fix something, you assume that you know how it should work. But when you're learning for the first time, you accept that you need to start from scratch. You accept that you're going to be clumsy. You accept that you're going to make mistakes. You accept that you're a beginner in something that other people learned in childhood. Jung called this reparenting of the self. The person has to become for themselves the parent they never had. They have to learn to give themselves the validation, The emotional mirroring, the unconditional acceptance that narcissistic parents never provided. But there's a cruel paradox here. How do you give yourself something that you've never experienced? How do you become a loving parent to your inner child when you have no internal reference for what healthy parental love is? Jung's answer was simultaneously simple and terribly difficult. You learn through the therapeutic relationship. You allow the therapist to become, temporarily, the parental figure who mirrors, who validates, who accepts unconditionally. And through that corrective experience, you internalize a new model of love. For Ethan, this meant 3 years of deep therapy, 3 years of learning slowly, painfully, that he could show vulnerability to his therapist and not be rejected, that he could express needs and not be ridiculed, that he could be imperfect, confused, emotionally messy, and still be accepted. And something extraordinary began to happen. As Ethan internalized this new experience of acceptance, he began to feel something he'd never felt before. Something warm in his chest when he thought about people he loved. Something that made him want to care, protect, be present, not out of obligation or fear of losing them, but out of genuine connection. Eros, that relational force that had been exiled into the shadow for decades, was slowly coming back to life. But now, something had changed. It wasn't the innocent, unconscious Eros of a small child anymore. It was a conscious, integrated, chosen Eros. A love that he was learning to feel, not by instinct, but by deliberate work of reconnecting with parts of himself that had been amputated. The second major Jungian turning point came when Ethan realized that his parents had also been wounded children who never learned how to love. This wasn't an excuse or justification for what they did. It was simply a recognition that the destruction of the capacity to love is transmitted generationally. His mom and dad destroyed in him what had been destroyed in them. Jung saw this as a crucial moment of individuation. The moment when a person stops seeing their parents as conscious villains and starts to see them as human beings, equally damaged by the same wound, not to forgive necessarily, but to break the unconscious identification with them, to stop repeating their patterns precisely because he now understood them as patterns, not as truths about how love works. Ethan began to realize that when he rejected vulnerability in partners, he was reproducing exactly the rejection that his mom had demonstrated. When he ridiculed emotion, he was channeling his dad. When he transformed love into control, he was perpetuating the only model of relationship he knew. And here is the real power of Jungian consciousness. Once you see the pattern, once you recognize that you're reproducing automatically what was done to you, you gain the possibility to choose differently. Not easy, not automatic, but possible. At 37, Ethan began a relationship that would be completely different from all the others. Not because he'd found the perfect person, but because he was, for the first time, emotionally present enough to really see another person as they were. Not as a projection of his needs or fears. When she demonstrated vulnerability, when she cried in front of him, Ethan felt the familiar impulse of repulsion and flight. But now he recognized this impulse as an echo of trauma, not as truth. He could pause, breathe, and consciously choose to stay, choose to hold her hand, choose to say the words that he'd never heard when he needed them. It's okay to feel this. I'm here. And something extraordinary happened in that moment. By giving her the emotional presence that he'd never received, he simultaneously healed the wound in his inner child. Each time he chose connection instead of escape, each time he chose vulnerability instead of control, he rewrote the neural pattern that had been established decades ago. Jung called this the process of individuation through relationship. A person doesn't heal alone, isolated. They heal through the repeated practice of choosing real love in real moments with real people. Through the corrective experience, repeated 1,000 times, until the new pattern replaces the old. The third Jungian turning point, the deepest of all, came when Ethan realized that the capacity to love had never been completely destroyed. It had been repressed, distorted, exiled into the shadow, but the core, that primary impulse of Eros, had always been there, waiting, frozen, but not dead. All the pain he'd felt for years, that emptiness in relationships, that feeling of incompleteness, wasn't an absence of love. It was the pain of repressed love trying to emerge. It was Eros knocking on the doors of the unconscious, trying to be recognized, integrated, released. And the healing journey wasn't about creating something new. It was about removing the barriers he'd built to protect himself. It was about melting the ice that had frozen his heart when he was 5 years old. It was about allowing that inner child, finally safe, finally seen, finally accepted, to love again. Jung taught that this is the true meaning of individuation, not becoming a different person, but becoming who you always were before the trauma, recovering the authentic self that was buried under layers of narcissistic defenses, integrating the shadow, recognizing the wounded child, and giving them, finally, what they always needed. Now, before we explore the signs that you might be carrying this same wound, I need to say something. If this video is touching on deep wounds, if you're recognizing your story in Ethan's story, you are not alone. There are millions of people who grew up in families where love was a transaction and vulnerability was danger. And the reason why I dedicate so much time researching Jung, studying the psychology of narcissistic formation, and bringing this knowledge to you, is because this information should be accessible. It shouldn't be locked away in academic books or reserved for those who can afford expensive therapy. It should be common knowledge. Each video like this costs hours of deep research, of careful synthesis, of translating complex Jungian concepts into language that makes sense for your real life. And when you use the super thanks down there, that golden heart, you're not just supporting the channel financially, you're saying this truth about how narcissism is formed and transmitted generationally needs to be known. You're saying more people need to understand that the capacity to love can be recovered. You're saying, I am part of the generation that breaks these cycles. So if this video brought clarity, if it named something that you felt but couldn't explain, if it offered hope that healing is possible, consider the super thanks. You help make it possible to continue bringing deep psychology from Jung to people who are doing the real work of healing themselves. Now, how do you know if this specific wound is active in you? There are signs that Jung identified. The first is the intellectualization of love. You talk about love perfectly, but you can't feel the real emotion. The second pattern is approaching relationships with intense enthusiasm, but fleeing when real intimacy threatens to develop. The third is being drawn to emotionally unavailable people. The fourth is transforming love into control. And the fifth is experiencing loneliness within relationships. Even when physically together, if you recognized any of these signs, it's highly likely you're carrying this wound. And here's the truth that Carl Jung wanted you to know. It's not your fault. You didn't choose this. This was done to you when you were too young to defend yourself. But now, as a conscious adult, you have a choice. You can continue repeating the patterns automatically, unaware that you're reproducing exactly what your parents did. Or you can do the terrifying yet liberating work of confronting the wound, integrating the shadow, and reclaiming the capacity for love that has always been within you, just waiting to be released. Healing isn't quick. It's not easy. Jung was right when he said that individuation is the work of a lifetime, but it is possible. Ethan is proof of that. Thousands of people who have done this work are proof of that, and you can be next. The steps are clear. Recognize the wound, find qualified help, allow yourself to feel the old pain, practice vulnerability in small, safe doses, and have radical patience with yourself. You are learning as an adult. Something that should have been taught in childhood, the ultimate truth that Jung discovered and that Ethan's story illustrates, is this: the capacity for love is never completely destroyed. It is repressed. It is distorted. It is exiled to the shadow, but the core remains. Eros, relational force, remains, waiting, frozen, for the moment when you finally create enough internal safety to let it emerge again. And when it emerges, it's not the naive, unconscious love of a child. It's something much deeper. It's conscious love, chosen love, love that knows pain and chooses connection anyway. Love that knows rejection and chooses vulnerability anyway. Love that has gone through the hell of the shadow and emerged stronger, more real, more human. You deserved to have learned this when you were 3 years old. You deserved mom and dad who mirrored your worth, who validated your emotions, who loved you unconditionally. You didn't get that, and that is a real loss that needs to be grieved. But you have now the possibility to give to yourself what you never received, to become the loving parent to your own inner child, to finally, after decades frozen, allow your heart to thaw, to learn, for the first time, what love really is. And when you do that, when you really do the work of integrating the shadow and reclaiming Eros, relational force, you don't just heal yourself, you break the generational cycle. You ensure that your children, if you have them, or the people you love, never have to carry this wound. You become the person who interrupts the transmission of trauma. And that, Jung would say, is individuation in its deepest sense. Now I want to hear from you. Comment below. Do you identify more with team, I can perform love perfectly, or team, I don't know what love really feels like? What is your truth? I'm curious to know how many of you recognized Ethan's story in your own life.